The Christian character of the Middle Ages. Unless one be addicted a priori to some of the cruder forms of materialism or the more naive forms of phenomenalism, it will not be denied that the ideas and ideals of men have force in the shaping of their history and institutions. In evaluating the institutions of medieval Europe, the utmost care must be taken to preserve the historical sense, to maintain a realistic perspective. There are not wanting writers who, having decided that religion is bad for the people, or that it is false or unscientific, have sought to legislate it out of existence as a creative factor in medieval Europe. The formula for such writers is simple. The things of which they approve in medieval society come from a spirit of opposition to religion, and all the things of which they do not approve come from the influence of faith. Actually, whether one approve or not, medieval Europe was a Christian society, a profoundly religious community that interpreted all things in terms of Jesus Christ and the Catholic Church. A medieval man would no more think of himself as being opposed to the Church than he would think of himself as being opposed to the weather. He might be furious over the fact that it rained on a given day, or that Rome or the bishop had decreed thus and so, but he did not set out to abolish either the weather or the Church. In the universities at that time, more populous than at any other time in history, all this was probed, analyzed, rationalized, systematized. Among the laity, it was accepted almost as uncritically as the modern populo minuto accepts all the hypotheses of science as dogma, and makes its active faith in the genesis of evolution, the Leviticus of statistical method, and the paralipomenon of Will Durant. The medieval concept of private property. The first ruling idea that is of importance in explaining medieval control of economic activity is the doctrine of private property. Ownership was generally held to be a natural right, especially after Aristotle's Politics became current. This right, however, was never unconditional. The face of the earth was ordained for the sustenance of all men. The most efficient means in the ordinary course of events for the attainment of that end was the division of the earth into private property. But this division could never be such as to defeat the primary purpose. This idea is epitomized by Aquinas. After establishing the right of dominion, he proceeds, "The other relation to external things is their use, and as far as this goes, no man ought to have anything proper to himself, but all in common, so that thus each may communicate easily to another his necessities. Hence, says the Apostle, charge the rich of this world not to be haughty or to set their hope on the uncertainty of riches, to do good, to be rich in good works, to be open-handed and generous. And therefore the division of goods that proceeds from human law cannot come in the way of men's need of being relieved out of such goods. To use the property of another, taking it secretly in a case of extreme need, cannot, properly speaking, be characterized as theft. This concept of property, which could be illustrated over and over again from contemporary writers, underlies all medieval economic activity. Private property is a legitimate and natural institution founding a true right. The administration of that institution and the exercise of that right cannot, however, justly interfere with the paramount purpose for which the face of the earth was designed, the sustenance of all men. As an immediate and inevitable corollary of this teaching, though having also an independent foundation in Scripture, arises the precept of almsgiving as a matter of grave obligation. Therefore, those who are rich are enjoined to be dispensers rather than owners. When we assist the poor, without doubt we do not proffer our own goods, but render to another that which is his. For in the eyes of a just judge we are regarded as merciful when we faithfully dispense things which are not ours, but are common. Peter Damian, A.D. 1090. Whoever possesses anything in this life is like the steward of the high king, nor are those things which he has his, but are committed to him by the Lord as to a procurator or agent. He ought so to minister the goods of the Lord, that he may have the necessities of life therefrom, and render to the Lord that which is left over. Think not, brethren, that when you give to the poor you render to them of your own. You give them what is theirs. Thus, Gregory, in the 45th Pastoral, says, "That earth from which you have taken is common to all men, and accordingly sustenance also is commonly offered to all." Peter Abelard, A.D. 1142. In truth, all things are to be shared in time of extreme necessity, for natural reason dictates that the welfare of our neighbor should be more highly prized than these temporal goods. William of Auxerre, A.D. 1231. Variations of the same theme could be recorded from every medieval writer on the subject. Theologians might dispute whether the obligation arose from justice or charity. In any case, it was real. The canonists might seek to devise legal means by which the poor might vindicate their right to share in goods, which had been left to some institution for the sake of the poor, but the right itself was beyond dispute. And the lavish eleemosynary establishments with which the guilds studded Europe are practical testimony to the acceptance of the theory. Given such a theory of property, given an organic concept of the state, for in civic relationships all men who belong to the same community are regarded as one body and the whole community as one man, the manner of economic control was inevitable. The members of the body do not fight against one another, and Christian men are together the body of Christ and severally his members. First Epistle of Paul to the Corinthians, chapter 12, verse 27. Men associate together in intelligent cooperation, and the association expresses itself in corporations, universitates in the sense of guilds, communes. Since there are various grades and orders in these communities, the highest is that of the commonwealth, which is ordained to procure by itself a sufficiency of goods for human life. Through diversity of function and status is the peace of temporal commonwealths promoted inasmuch as there are many thereby who participate in public affairs. Under the aegis of the commonwealth, therefore, lesser associations will perform the functions necessary for the prosperity of the community, but the subsidiary corporations are to be left alone. The optimum in any government is that things should be provided for according to their own measure, for in this does the justice of an administration consist. Accordingly, it would be against the principle of human government if men were to be prevented by the governor of the commonwealth from carrying out their own functions, unless perchance for a brief time because of some emergency. The interference that is justified in time of extreme emergency and the regulation required to maintain organic balance at all times are based on a principle that harks back to the doctrine on property. All particular goods which men obtain are ordained to the common good as to their end. Such is the rationale of a guild economy. The burghers of Ulm probably could not have explained it systematically any better than George Babbitt could have expounded the full evangel of rugged individualism. The former would not understand the profound implications of the mystical body of Christ, and the latter does not know anything about the blind and dumb deistic providence that lurks in the premises of laissez-faire. But the bishop could explain it to the burgher, and the confessor apply it for him, as the banker explained it to George when he made his quarterly confession in his financial statement. And thus are things done when an institution is the accepted way of doing them. Contracts. As property and business are matters of public and social concern, so too are contracts. Contracts are freely entered into, without compulsion, but they take place within the framework of society. What the Supreme Court of the United States was constrained to observe in a pivotal case was a medieval commonplace. The conclusion was that such contracts must be understood as having been made in reference to the possible exercise of the rightful authority of the government, that no obligation of contract can extend to the defeat of that object. Parties cannot remove their transactions from the domain of dominant constitutional authority by making contracts about them, gold clause cases. Since, in the words of Bernardin of Siena, died 1344, the chief purpose of both civil and private contracts is the common good, the guild economy was not at all backward in outlawing all sorts of contracts that were seen to be contrary to public policy. The medieval view of liberty was more realistic than the modern. Liberty is a relative term, depending on what it is that one is free from. By the mere fact that I choose one thing, I make it impossible to do the opposite. To be absolutely free to do everything is impossible and contradictory. A person who has been properly vaccinated is no longer free to catch smallpox. I am really free when I am able to seek the good that I wish and when I am not forced to seek it. Just price. From the doctrine on private property as stated, and from the doctrine on the organic nature of society and its functional organization, the doctrine of just price follows as a ready corollary. If the face of the earth remains in a radical sense the patrimony of all men, and if, in their efforts to reduce the face of the earth to their service, men work cooperatively like the highly interdependent organs of a body, then obviously the exchange of what is produced under these circumstances must be made equitably. Justice, according to Ulpian, and the whole canonist tradition, requires that we render to each man that which is his to an equality. Goods are exchanged in terms of their value, but since the productive process is a social process, the value of a commodity is based not on the estimate of this or that individual, but upon its social utility, as expressed in the community estimate of its social value. From Albertus Magnus of Cologne. According to this analysis, the carpenter ought to receive the product of the tanner, and in turn pay the tanner that which, according to a just exchange, is his. Otherwise, there is no correspondence in labor and expense. If, however, such exchanges do not take place in this manner, proportionate equality is not preserved. And when this equality is not preserved, the community is not maintained, because labor and expense is not repaid. For all indeed would be destroyed if he who makes a contract for so much goods of such a kind does not receive a similar quality and quantity. The state cannot be built up of one type of workers alone. Properly, therefore, these things are exchanged, not absolutely, but with a certain comparison to their value according to use and need. And Aquinas. If, however, this reciprocity is absent, there will be no equality of the things exchanged, and thus men will no longer be able to dwell together. All the crafts would be destroyed if each would not receive an amount proportionate to that which he produced. And Aquinas, in another work. Buying and selling were instituted for the common good of both parties, since each needs the products of the other. But what was introduced for the common utility ought not to bear harder on one party than on another, and therefore the contract between them ought to rest on an equality of thing to thing. And therefore to sell a thing dearer or to buy it cheaper than it is worth is in itself unjust and illicit. The just price of things, however, is not determined to a precise point, but consists in a certain estimate. The price of an article is changed according to difference in location, time, and risk, to which one is exposed in carrying it from place to place, or in causing it to be carried. Not so long ago, the prevailing academic mood considered it good form to dismiss the doctrine of just price with a patronizing observation about objective value and canonist teaching. Such statements have no relation to historical fact, and consequently are not made today by people who have profited by the examination of medieval documents accomplished during the last 50 years. Even yet, we are without proper documentary evidence of the precise manner of the impact of authority on the market, in the matter of price. Sliding scales of prices for foodstuffs instituted by public officials are available, but definite cases for other commodities are scarce. The doctrine of just price was not based on a value supposedly inherent in the object. It was the expression of the estimate of the community on the value of a commodity offered in a market that was genuinely fair, open, and without fraud. The chief difference between scholastic just price and classic natural price is that the liberals believed their deistic providence constituted fair markets automatically through the magic of competition, no matter how hard men tried to make them unfair. The guildsmen believed that men were the sons of Adam as well as of God, and that the accomplishment of the designs of providence required the sedulous application of human reason as well as cooperation with divine grace. As a special case of the doctrine of just price, there was the matter of the condemnation of usury. This doctrine was not based, as is sometimes said, on a dictum of Aristotle. The Old Testament contains disciplinary prohibitions to this end, and in the New Testament are texts that, although not teaching the doctrine explicitly, may appropriately be quoted as approving the discipline. The argument underlying the prohibition was not unique, but was of a piece with the principles with which the canonists attacked all problems arising under contracts. If I lend you a durable good, a tool, or a draft horse, the ownership can be distinguished from the use, and I can charge you for the use while retaining the ownership. In the case of goods that cease to exist with their first use, bread, for example, or wine, I cannot charge you for the use while retaining the ownership. I can sell you the wine, but if I lend it to you, I can ask for nothing more in return than the value of it. Money evidently belonged in this second category, being good for nothing but to be spent. Therefore, to charge a price for its use as distinct from its ownership was an obvious violation of justice. The Council of Vienne startled no one when in 1311 it declared, "If anyone shall fall into such an error that he should pertinaciously presume to affirm that to practice usury is not a sin, we decree that he should be punished as a heretic." At all times, however, the canonists allowed that interest be taken if the circumstances of the loan were such that an extrinsic title existed, such as loss arising from having made the loan, the sacrifice of an opportunity for gain, or genuine risk to the capital. Moreover, through a contract of partnership, one could always go into an enterprise and receive compensation for the use of his money, since it was then actually hazarded. Some transactions condemned by modern historians as usurious evidently fall into that category. In a handicraft economy, money was, as a general thing, relatively barren. The possession of a fund of money for the majority of the people was not then so great an asset as is working capital today, and for this reason a loan of money, when none of the special circumstances mentioned above was verified, was actually the loan of a sterile thing, and a charge for its use as distinct from its ownership was a charge for something that did not exist. In such an economy, if people made loans for consumption purposes with no thought of employing the money in production, all the money would soon indeed be in the hands of the usurers, especially since medieval rates were enormous. All the abuse that medieval preachers heaped upon them as the bloodsuckers of the people would be and was merited. The prohibition of usury in such a non-monetary society was but the application of the precept of charity and an indispensable piece of social legislation. With the growth of capitalistic enterprise, new extrinsic titles were admitted by the canonists and the scope of old ones was widened, until in recent times the fact that money may always be readily exchanged for productive goods causes it to be regarded as virtually productive, and therefore interest may always be taken on a loan of money, for it is no longer, in canonical terminology, a mutuum, but a locatio, the hire of a useful thing. We prescind here from the question as to how much productivity there is in indefinitely expansible bank credit. Nothing in the shift in economic structure can relieve the obligation of coming to the assistance of a fellow man in need, no matter how profitably I might otherwise be able to employ the funds that I might give to him. The medieval doctrine on usury was a reasonable interpretation of the monetary and social facts of the day, an imperative discipline to avoid social evils, and no deterrent to economic expansion, for there was ample room for legitimate contracts within the framework of the unquestioned extrinsic titles. Extrinsic titles should not be confused with subterfuges, as some writers do confuse them. Subterfuges were treated by the canonists in their own place as usura palliata, cloaked usury. In general, the doctrine of the just price and the doctrine on usury were accepted and lived up to. Exceptions and violations there were, of course, but they were recognized as abnormalities and offenses against public policy, and were penalized for what they were. Whether or not these controlling ideas interfered with freedom depends entirely upon what it is from which one wished to be free. The decline of the guilds. 3 types of factors may be assigned as causes of the decline, failure, and ultimate extinction of the guilds. Changes in the economic, spiritual, and political spheres all contributed to the disappearance of the guilds, but these factors are closely interwoven. In the first group falls the Black Death, coming in the middle of the 14th century. The apocalyptic toll which that plague levied would have strained any economic system to the breaking point, had it had no other effect than the numerical change in physical producers. After the Black Death, the craft guilds lost their vitality and flexibility, and manifested many of the faults that had come to characterize the merchant guilds. The fall of Constantinople, the new channels of trade, mercurial price changes attendant upon the influx of gold, and widespread debasement of the currency called for a capacity of adjustment that no longer existed. The second circumstance, which was in its turn aggravated by the Black Death, was the attenuation of the Christian spirit and the relaxation of the fiber of Christian society caused by the renaissance of pagan ideology. The papacy at Avignon, the Great Western Schism, the monastic lands administered by a handful of survivors of the Black Death, whose places were taken by improperly trained successors, were none of them calculated to inspire an attitude of cooperation and association. Ultimately, the strongest factor of all was the rise of nationalism and the omnicompetent state, and the systematic promotion thereof by the jurisconsults of the Roman law. In its first phase, this represented a combination of burghers and crafts with the crown against the feudal proprietors, and is typified by Philip the Fair and Henry VII of England. In its last phase, when the guilds had been long atrophied and had failed to grow to the range of a national market, it meant that the national government sought to supply all the regulation that was formerly furnished by the lesser autonomous bodies within the structure of the state. Even the most enlightened and benevolent despotic bureaucracy cannot hope to carry off successfully so complex a task, and the result is that the modern liberal state, omnipotent in theory, is quite impotent in practice. The regulation that the guilds formerly imposed upon themselves in modern society is imposed upon everybody by those who control the state. And those who control the state ask only, in the sweet name of liberty, to be left alone. An evaluation. A sane evaluation of the guild system as a method of economic control is not easy, for the guilds have suffered sorely at the hands of both their friends and their critics. Romantics of the 19th century painted guild life in dainty colors and yearned for the golden age that was gone. 19th century liberals, with an unsurpassed ignorance of medieval life and thought, stretched the guild upon the rack of their meta-historical presuppositions and derided the caricature. Men who believed in miracles could not possibly have done anything right. Heinrich Pesche's measured judgment is probably close to the truth. The handicraft worker of the Middle Ages would not have recognized the picture the Romantics painted as having anything to do with him. Light and shadow are well blended in the guild scene, but the associations were economically efficient. They did raise the volume of regular production of useful goods, and they distributed the increased product equitably, at least within the system. The principle of their organization is sound. Living and growing as it did when it extended from merchant to craftsman, it had unlimited possibilities. But when lower grades in the community were excluded from enjoying the same type of status as that possessed by those already organized, the guilds belied their own vital principle, withered, and were destroyed. The void that their ultimate extinction left has never been filled, and the complete absence of a common way of life among moderns makes it a fair question whether or not there is a sufficient substratum of natural virtue to enable people to get together on an associational basis to fill that void. The guilds were possible because there was a prevailing pattern of social thought that no one questioned, and that could be used as a foundation for social action. Today, far from agreeing upon the nature of man and his destiny, the schools are at loggerheads over the preambles of philosophy. Yet if we cannot find some reasonable principle for common action, it is still true that all the crafts will be destroyed, and the community will not be maintained.